Well, hey there. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome once again to Orange Weekly, presented by Crouse Health. My name is Brent Axe from syracuse.com, and we like to pop on live here Thursdays about 1 o'clock-ish and talk Syracuse sports with you. Today, we're live on the Syracuse Orange Basketball Facebook page as Syracuse comes down the stretch here. One last regular season game against Miami on Saturday, then into the ACC tournament, and we already know what Syracuse's early path in the tournament looks like. It's obviously an ACC tournament that they need to win if they're going to make the NCAA tournament, and the worst possible path was put in front of the Orange for that. We will discuss. Jim Boeheim called my radio program yesterday and made some news. We will get into that here on Orange Weekly. We've got the CNY lacrosse page up and running live here, so we'll get into the latest lacrosse news on both the men's and women's front. The men lost to Army yesterday. They've lost 3 in a row, fall to 1-3 on the season. And in the words of Syracuse head coach Gary Gait, they're still trying to find the right buttons to push on this team, showing that it is a transition and showing that even with an all-star coaching staff and everything that made headway and headlines in the offseason, this is still a process for Syracuse lacrosse. So we are here live, but this show does archive on YouTube. It archives automatically on these Facebook pages. You're watching the show. We fire it out on our social media channels. We put up a post on syracuse.com as well. So if you do miss the show live, with your chance to interact, hop in the comment section, add some comments, ask some questions here as we go. We love highlighting what you guys have to say on the show. If you do miss it live, though, as mentioned, it does archive, and you can watch it in a number of places on your time when you want. So let's start with some basketball. Jim Boeheim called my radio program yesterday, and unscheduled. Didn't know Jim was going to call. It was last week. It was Mike in Durham calling Jim's show unexpectedly. In this case, it was Jim in Syracuse calling into the program right at the top of the show. So my radio program, for those of you not aware, I do a radio show here in Syracuse that airs on ESPN Syracuse weekdays from 4 to 6. Right at 4 o'clock, my producer comes in. He's waving at me manically through the door. There's a window in the door, and he's waving at me. And I at first thought that he was confirming a guest we were working on to have at 4:20 that day. The show's on from 4 to 6. I'm just starting the show, and I think that's kind of what he's doing. Like, okay, we're all good there, but that's not what it was. He was calling to inform me that Jim Boeheim was on the line. Now, Jim has done this before, and this is what I appreciate about Jim. Agree or disagree, Jim knows he's got an open line to call my show. I say a lot about Jim and his teams on my radio program, writing on syracuse.com, the post-game shows we do here, and Twitter in a number of formats, right? So I've made it pretty clear to Jim that line's open for him anytime to respond to what he wants to respond to. So he calls right at the top of the show. First thing on my mind, of course, was Julie Boeheim, because if you guys haven't heard the news, most of you, I'm sure, have heard in some way, shape, or form that unfortunately Julie got held up at gunpoint earlier this week in the parking lot of Destiny USA, had her purse stolen, and thankfully she's okay physically. Mentally, as Jim told us yesterday, she's a little shaken up, but also almost the next breath from Julie is she's worried about, in this case, it was like a 12, 13-year-old kid, it's been reported. Young, I mean, think about that. 13-year-old kid robbing you at gunpoint, right? It's hard to process, but that's unfortunately kind of the world we're in today. And Julie was worried about that kid, saying, how can we help this kid? I want to help him. What would lead him to do such a thing, right? So Jim gave us the update on that. Jim then got into a little bit of what I wrote in the column. You know, there was some semantics there. I used the word defiant. As I saw the press conference after the Duke game, he was asked about retirement and pretty much said, you know, why you guys keep asking me about this? I put it on the record. I've said it 26,000 times. It was certainly in the air, of course, with Mike Krzyzewski's retirement and Duke coming through with the retirement tour on Saturday. I wrote the column, and then yesterday, there he is. And in the course of the conversation, Jim reveals something that was not made public until yesterday, that there is a plan in place for him to retire. He knows when he's going to retire. He described the plan as ironclad in terms of what the succession plan is for Jim when he moves on. Now, he didn't give details of it. He didn't tell us when the plan goes into place. He didn't say what his last year was going to be, nor who the next coach would be, if in fact the next coach has been selected, which one would think an ironclad plan would indicate a succession plan there, right? So that was pretty big deal. And reacting to that was incredible. The energy of the show and everything that happened, can happen. We're on a live show now. Live radio is the same thing. It just can blow up with something different. The course of the show can change in an instant, particularly, we got a guy like Jim Boeheim calling in, and he discussed a few other things about this team and going forward. And, it doesn't feel like it's a big deal. If they do end up having a losing season, he'd like to avoid it, of course, but he's had 45 winning seasons. If this one ends up not being one, maybe he's not as upset about that as one would think, would lose sleep over it, as he put it. But I mean, as the most competitive person I know, they're going to do everything they can, and he is going to do everything he can to prevent that. So that was the backdrop of the week. And to do that with a couple games left in the season, I would certainly anticipate that if the season was over, you kind of reflect and going forward. But wow, big news there. And we appreciate Jim calling the show to do that and break that news. And now people are kind of wondering, as Jimmy says here in the comments, did you get the impression next year is his last? Now, he was pretty adamant about coaching next year's team. He's told those recruits specifically, I will coach you. So I asked Jim in the conversation yesterday, I said, well, what about the recruits beyond that? And beyond that, Jim said, we will inform them of the plan. What he didn't say was, I will coach you, as he told this class. So beyond next season, it's pretty much year by year. It's touch and go. Any year could be the last, which of course was the case generally. You got a 77-year-old man who's the oldest coach in Division I college basketball. It's going to come to the end at some point. But Jim is, just to his credit, broken the mold on this so many times. Remember, there was the plan in place for Mike Hopkins to take over back in 2018, which of course that blew up when Hopkins took the Washington job. Maybe Hopkins is the plan to come back. I don't know. I'm just speculating there. One would assume it's probably either Adrian Autry or Jerry McNamara, which someone's going to get their heart broken there in that instance if one does not get picked for the other and would they stay on the staff. But, we'll kind of save that speculation for when we learn exactly what the details of the plan would be. But he's definitely coaching next year, Jimmy. And if I had to put money on it, it kind of feels like next year is going to be the last one. Doesn't mean it's going to. Jim has certainly marched to the beat of his own drummer before, and he's going to continue to do that. Very young team coming in next year. And I know we've got Miami coming up in the ACC tournament, but it's natural to kind of look over the horizon a little bit here with Joe Girard coming back, Symir Torrance coming back, Jesse Edwards coming back. By the way, assuming none of these people go in the transfer portal, which is always a possibility, right? A lot of freshmen on this team next year. Will Cole Swider come back? Now, Swider is participating in the senior day activities coming up. We know Jimmy Boeheim's gone. We know Buddy Boeheim's gone. Even if Jimmy gets that extra year of eligibility, it's not likely he's going to use it. Cole, Jim Boeheim said, is not coming back next year, but that window is still open. Cole did an interview this week. It's been a great series of exit interviews on syracuse.com. I hope you guys can check out with Cole, Barama, Jimmy, Buddy, the outgoing players for this team, at least we know about. Cole's leaving the door open. He might be back, but at this point, the head coach is certainly under the impression he's not coming back, right? So you've got a mix of any of those that do decide to come back with Chris Bunch, with the recruiting class coming in, Justin Taylor, who I imagine is going to get out there and get playing time. And he's in a lot of ways a clone of Buddy Boeheim and the type of player that he is. They're recruiting Judah Mintz pretty hard. He was at the Duke game. Great combo guard for Syracuse, if he, in fact, commits to Syracuse, which I think he's going to. I've been given the impression, some sources have told me that Syracuse is pretty confident they're going to land him, but you never know until the kid actually officially announces, so we'll keep an eye on that. One way or the other, this is going to be a very young team next year. You had, of course, Benny Williams, who has committed to coming back. He will be there, despite all the speculation that he wasn't going to be with the lack of playing time that he got up until recently. What a great game he played against Duke. And to have that in his memory bank and to build on the confidence of that in the offseason is a big thing for him. Jim's even indicated they're going to play some man-to-man next year and kind of adjust to what kind of roster it is. So, Jimmy, to answer your question, if in fact that's his last season, it's going to be a fascinating one to watch. And then if the plan, which we now know about, goes into play. So recruits are going to be told about the plan. Jim indicated yesterday about Mike Krzyzewski and what's going on there. Mike announces before the season, essentially goes on a retirement tour. I've always had the impression that Jim doesn't want to do that and will not do that. And Jim pretty much said that yesterday. Like, that's probably not the best way to do it. He's known, in his words, 100 coaches that have done it. 99 did it after the season. Mike did it his way. I hope Jim goes on a retirement tour, frankly, when we know it's his last season, so he gets the accolades he deserves. And I think that's kind of cool what we've seen with Coach K this year. I think Jim deserves that, and it would be great to see. I don't get the impression he'd like to do that, and that's certainly his choice for him to go out the way he wants to go out. Jim saying on the show yesterday, too, not his choice who the next coach is, despite the impression that he's basically going to anoint his successor. He said, this was not my choice. So take it for what it's worth. It's what he said on the program. I certainly believe him, and he's no reason to call up and steer people the wrong way. As Doug says here, I'll believe it when I see it. When it comes to man, I'm with you there because I feel like we've seen that before. But he's been more specific and saying it earlier than ever before. And I asked him about it yesterday on the radio show, Doug, and he said it's the makeup of the roster next year, that they've got to look at it and examine it, and a much more athletic team than this one was, and it could benefit this team. Now, I still think they're going to play plenty of zone. It's not like they're switching to man as the defense, but for the first time in a long time, since Lemoyne beat Syracuse in that exhibition game, we could possibly see it interacted, and not as like a press or trying to come back type of thing, like some real man-to-man, which I'm with you, Doug. I'll believe it when I see it, man. I've heard that story before, but interesting nonetheless that he's talked about it. As Adam says here, I don't believe that Jimmy and Buddy are 100% gone. Feels like Jim wants to keep all the recruits coming with all this talk of next season. He said Cole is gone, and 3 days later, Cole doesn't corroborate that. Adam, Buddy is 100% gone. Buddy said it on the record a number of times. I know he told our friend Mike Waters this story that you'll read on syracuse.com coming up. He's told me this on the radio. Jim said yesterday on the radio, Buddy is 100% gone, so he is. Jimmy, I talked to Jimmy today. It's an interview that's going to air later on the radio. I don't think he's coming back. You got to leave that small crack open that he could, but Jimmy did a great exit interview with Donna DeToto that I would encourage you to go read. All the signs there that he's going, and he's going to move on and see what other opportunities are out there. Got a degree in finance from Cornell. So if basketball is not in his future, I mean, that's a guy that's, I might be going to him for some financial advice in the future. He's well set up for life, one way or the other. Good for him with a Cornell degree, now a Syracuse degree as a graduate. Could he get some pro basketball opportunities internationally or something of that nature? I mean, why not go try and see what you can get? But those two are definitely 100% gone. Cole, he could come back. You know, it's interesting that Jim said that and said it definitively that he was leaving, and now maybe the window's open, but you know, it's a process. It's a different mind frame when you're in the season, you still have games to play versus when you know, okay, it's over. And now your focus goes completely 100% on that type of thing, right? I'm sure these guys have thought about it beforehand, but now it's like, okay, we made the plan. Now we got to decide, right? We brought up 3 different things we could get for dinner tonight, but now we got to pick. What are we going to get, right? That's a much bigger decision on what to have for dinner, because that's something you make every day, but you get the point. Now it's like real, like make the call. What's going to happen? What are we going to do? So yeah, the transition in next year, but there's still 2 games left that we know about. Miami on Saturday and at least 1 game in the ACC tournament. So we know the path. Syracuse is in the 8-9 game. They will play at noon on Wednesday against Florida State, a team they split with this year. And then if they win that game, well, guess who's next? Number 1 Duke. Duke is the top seed. Duke has clinched the regular season championship in the ACC, and Duke has beaten Syracuse by 20 and 25 points, respectively, of course, as we just saw last weekend. So Syracuse's chances of winning 4 games in a row were paper thin to start with, just given how this team has struggled to do that this year. They did win 4 games in a row at one point, but to do that in Brooklyn in those circumstances, without Jesse Edwards, I don't think we're going to see Symir Torrance on Saturday. We'll see. He's in concussion protocol, and you got to be careful about that. And he's certainly not going to play if he hasn't been practicing all week. So we'll see what the situation is there for Brooklyn. John Bolajak has not been available as of late with a lower leg injury. There's just so much working against Syracuse. And now you got to play Duke in round 2, even if you get by Florida State. So what this team's playing for now is to be above 500, to avoid the first losing season in Jim Boeheim's tenure. They're 15-15. You beat Miami. Let's just say you're 16-15, win a game against Florida State. Now you're right there. And then you got to decide, first of all, you have to be picked for the NIT. which is not a guarantee. If this team falls below 500, that will not preclude them from going into the NIT. The NIT waived that rule a few years ago. They basically can pick who they want to. Now, there are some requirements. They are not, this would be the case with the ACC, but if there is a conference champion available to the NIT, they're actually obligated to take them first and then kind of pick from there. So it's not really a guarantee Syracuse even gets picked for the NIT, but let's say they do, and they're let's say they go in the NIT at 500 and they lose in round one and they finish, what would that be? 16-17 on the year, something like that. And that loss was in the NIT, that would sting. I don't think they turned down a chance to play in the NIT. The only reason I think they would is they're running out of bodies. We mentioned it. Symir's hurt. Jesse's been hurt. John Bull. Maybe these guys are just too tired, too banged up. And, motivation's always a question mark in a situation like that. So at the very least, we know 2 games are left, and then we'll see beyond that what kind of postseason Syracuse gets into. I feel like this is a season people just want to end. And that's not a knock on this team. These guys have played their butts off. I mean, the Duke games aside, they've been in pretty much every game. Look at the North Carolina game Monday and the response that they had. They came out firing, back and forth game. Man, another inbounds play goes awry. Still had a chance to go to overtime and make up for it, right? So the grit in the heart of this team cannot be questioned. They're a likable team, and I really enjoyed watching them. They just didn't have the talent and the athleticism, and then when they lost Jesse, things just kind of fell apart, and they became the team that they are. Buddy and Jimmy concluding their Syracuse careers. Buddy in particular, I mean, this is a guy that's moved into a top 13 scorer in Syracuse history. Personally, single-handedly, in a way, delivered a Sweet 16 for Syracuse last year. The three-point threat he became, obviously being Jim's son, that was always a story, but I'm happy for Buddy that he kind of escaped that shadow and everybody's like, oh, he's just playing because he's the coach's kid, right? That guy's near the leading scorer in the ACC this year. Top 13 scorer in Syracuse history. The Sweet 16, the accomplishments he's had. This is a good player. Now, Buddy certainly has his flaws defensively and other places on the court, but I really like what Buddy's done and what he's accomplished. And you know what, guys? He's just a great kid. I've got the chance to not only cover Buddy, but I mentioned I interview him once a week on the radio and, some behind the scenes stuff. You get to know people a little bit, just from whatever you can publicly, of course. But man, he's just such a great kid. And of course he got that from his mom, right? Put that joke out there. But man, the fact that he's done, even though Jimmy only played for 1 season, it feels like it's the end of a journey for him because we've been following him at Cornell. He played Syracuse every year. He comes and obviously plays at Syracuse. Look, Jimmy really struggled against some of the better teams, namely Duke, in the league. But for that guy to average 13 points a game, be in double figures as consistently as he was, he made a contribution to this team. There were people that said he couldn't hang in the ACC, didn't belong out there. He belonged. He proved he could play. Now, Duke obviously swamped him and a couple teams he just couldn't match wits with. But most of the teams he did, he could. And I thought gave Syracuse more than, even Jim has said this, Jim Boeheim, than they ever expected from him. If Cole, in fact, leaves, I mean, he is the consummate example of college basketball in the day and age. You can go somewhere else, make an instant impact, 36 points the other night. He's always going to have that, even in a loss, no matter what his Syracuse career becomes, if it ends or continues next year. How about Barama Sidibe? We thought he had a senior year last year, decides to come back and just got wrecked by injury, but made a huge contribution down the stretch for this team. I'll say it again, the guts and determination this team showed really funneled through Barama, played hard, gave this team what they needed. 15, 17, 20 minutes of rebounds, some plays under the basket, some grit, some hustle, diving into, piles on the court, going for loose balls. Man, if he didn't get hurt, we started to see it at the end of 2 seasons ago. He was on a real heater and just couldn't get over the injuries. But I think that's somebody Syracuse fans will appreciate for leaving it all on the court, quite literally. And how about the mighty Patty Casey and some of the walk-ons, the guys that we don't really talk about that often, but are there at practice every day and got to be a part of this team for a season. And a pretty interesting group that's going to be moving on here from Syracuse. A few more of your comments. Jimmy says, is Symir out against Miami? Jimmy, my guess is yes. That's not official yet, but they are certainly going to be cautious about that, particularly if he hasn't been practicing all week. I'm pretty sure Jim will give an update on that today on both his radio program and just in general. He makes a couple of media appearances on Thursday. Thank you, Frank. Says totally agree with you there. Jeff says, I hope Syracuse wins the ACC tournament in Brooklyn. No one should be surprised if it happens. Jeff, I got to be honest with you. I'll be stunned if that happens. And he says, let's prove the critics wrong and win the ACC tournament. I'd love to see it because it'd be a hell of a story, number one. And I like good stories. You know, when you're in the media business, you like to cover good stories. Two, I'd rather cover a team that's in the NCAA tournament and talk about a team that's in the NCAA tournament. It's just more interesting, right? But I would be stunned if it happened because of the lack of bodies, because this team is still flawed defensively, and because that means they beat Duke. This team cannot beat Duke. And you never say never in sports. I understand that, but we've seen this team play Duke twice and didn't belong on the same court with them. How's that going to change in the ACC tournament, particularly early? If you catch Duke a couple games in, maybe. I don't know. The noon game, sometimes you're not ready. You catch them napping, but as long as Duke remembers what time the game is and that it's at, the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, they're going to win that game. So I'd love to see it because it'd be a great story, but I would be absolutely positively stunned. I agree with Kelly here, who says everyone would be stunned in that. And Adam brings up a great point. Syracuse does not perform well in the ACC tournament, even in good years. Yeah, the ACC tournament has not been kind. They have, in recent years, won a couple of games in the tournament, which was different from before, but usually not a kind place for Syracuse. One year they just didn't have the opportunity to keep going because the world shut down during the ACC tournament, but for the most part has not been pleasant to Syracuse. So that's the basketball front. Let me get into a few lacrosse thoughts here for our friends watching on CNY Lacrosse and just in general, because that's heating up. What a game at the Dome yesterday. Now, I was on the radio when this was happening, and Jim Boeheim called and did his thing, so we were kind of scrambling and reacting to that, but I had the game on, and I kept an eye on it. Army has now beaten Syracuse twice. Army is always a tough matchup. This is one of the better Army teams they've had in recent years, but Army just plays you hard for 4 quarters, and they're going to challenge you in every which way but loose. Syracuse, I think Gary Gay put it best. They just don't know what buttons to push right now. This team desperately misses Owen Hiltz on the offensive end. Shout out to Owen Siebold and Brendan Curry and Tucker Dornovic, who are doing their thing. They just don't have enough weapons on offense. I thought Bobby Gavin was the answer at goal, the transfer that they brought in from Virginia. He really struggled yesterday. They had to put in Harrison Thompson. I still think Gavin is the goalie, but it doesn't matter who the goalie is. This defense is, I just got to say it, it's bad. I think Brett Kennedy's out of position. He needs to be in that position, given kind of the lack of talent behind him. I love Dave Petramala. He's going to fix this at some point, but it just goes to show you guys, look, you could have Gary Gay, Dave Petramala, Pat March. T.D. Erlin is on this staff, is one of the best face-off men in the history of the game. It's a process. It takes time. You have to adjust to the roster you have while recruiting, and there's help on the way. Joey Spallina comes in next year. He's the number 1 recruit in the country. They've got a terrific long pull coming in next year and a few other 4 or 5-star recruits. It's going to take a year for Gary to put his system in. Gary is known for innovating, being creative, but he's got to figure it out with this roster. He's got what he's got, and he's got to work with what he has. All the problems Syracuse has were on the field yesterday. This team plays hard. They gave Maryland all they could handle. Virginia kind of, beat them down early, but they got shut out in the 4th quarter by Army. So all the problems showed up. They just don't have enough dynamic scorers, and their defense is poor, right? Because Army also, I think they scored 5 goals in the 4th quarter yesterday. Correct me if I'm wrong. So the men's team is 1-3, and it's not looking like this is an NCAA tournament caliber team. You've got to win a couple games in the ACC. You've got to take care of business against teams like Army. They didn't. So they got to find some wins as they go down the stretch here against, Syracuse always has a tough schedule, but the games you can control, games against Hopkins and Hobart this Sunday, like you can't be. Hobart's better than usual, by the way. Ryan Archer is one of the best players in the country, so don't be stunned if Hobart wins that game. But just goes to show you, Syracuse made all the right moves. They brought in all the right coaches. Now you got to let the process play out. Women's team got snipped the other night by Northwestern. 2nd straight overtime game. Syracuse beat Notre Dame in overtime, the women's team now. Then they go to Northwestern, who's right there with Syracuse, top 5 team in the country, even without Izzy Skane, who's an amazing player. She unfortunately got hurt before the season. So for those of you that are getting into women's lacrosse, particularly with this team being a national championship contender. Look, I played lacrosse. I'm a huge fan of the sport. I still don't get some of these rules in lacrosse, why they call what they call, how they call it. There was a really strange call in overtime of that game that gave Northwestern a free position. If you're not familiar with the free position in women's lacrosse, so some calls, it's almost like a penalty shot in hockey. So when there's certain penalties, you line up on the 8-meter line and you literally get a free run at the goal. You line up at a certain situation, other players line up on the 8-meter arc, and everybody just runs towards the goal. But it gives the player with the ball a distinct advantage at this point. I don't think games in overtime should end on a free position. Dana Boyle, who's a big former lacrosse player, she's an ESPN commentator. She actually retweeted my thoughts on that this week and agreed and mentioned that games shouldn't end on a free position. But I just think in generally, the powers that be in women's lacrosse have to take a step back and recognize here's a good thing. Your game's getting much more popular. People are coming on board. The ratings are going up. There's great teams out there. There's a lot more interest in the sport. But even people that, and I'm speaking for many here that I've seen on social media have told me this, even people that know your game, watch it and still don't get some of these calls, how they happen, why they happen, and in some cases, what they are, right? So look, you can't be baseball here where, I still don't know what the infield fly rule is in baseball. I kind of do, but I couldn't explain it to you if I tried. You got to simplify the game. You got to take out some of these complicated things, streamline it. Kelly says it here. If you ask some of the girls, they'd love to play the men's game. It's not a matter of men's, women's game, but the men's game, the rules are just simpler. I think we kind of know what's going on. Why do they stick check in women's lacrosse after every goal and things that just hold up games? I think they got to take a look at this stuff because, again, the positive momentum is your sport's picking up just that. A lot of momentum. People are watching it. More people in Syracuse are going to pay attention to them because they're good. They got a lot of stars, and they could win the national championship. They brought back Kayla Trainer as a great coach and has a loaded roster right out of the chute here. So in the micro, I think, look, Syracuse they've got a really tough schedule, a lot on the road. They'll learn from this. They'll get better from this. The big matchup is way down the street here against Boston College at the end of the season. And I think they'll be playing their best lacrosse when they go into the postseason and play that team. But, they've still got a lot of tough games left. And hey, guess what? When you want to win the national championship, in order to be the best, you got to beat the best. And for the most part, Syracuse has handled their business in these close games. That was their first loss of the season, but kind of a strange way to lose. Nobody knew why Northwestern got that free position, and then they got it. It's like, okay, whatever. Syracuse had other opportunities to win that game. So I don't want to put it all on that, but good news is a lot more people are watching and are into this. The bad news is you're confusing your viewers. And I think it's time for you to take a hard look at that. So we'll see how the Orange recover from that. The men's team takes on Hobart this weekend on Sunday. I'll be at the Dome for that, by the way. So if you're there, say hello, and all the coverage to come on Sunday here on syracuse.com. The Orange basketball team, as we mentioned, plays Miami on Saturday. So we'll be here with post-game coverage right after that game on Syracuse basketball post-game on the same channel if you're watching live on Syracuse Orange basketball on Facebook. We should know, too, the women's team, it's going to be interesting to see what happens women's basketball now because their season's essentially over. They lost in the ACC tournament. And are they going to continue with Vaughn Reed at head coach? They did not have a good year. They had a completely new roster. There were some highlights, some good moments, some fun players, Tisha Hyman notably, to watch on that team, Crystalline Carr, the Cars, who are unrelated, who are great players. They've got to go in a different direction, in my opinion. And that direction is about 2.5 hours west on the thruway at the University of Buffalo in Felicia Leggett-Jack. Bring her home. You retired her jersey. She's a Syracuse legend. She wants the job, right? There it is, Kelly. I jumped you by just a few seconds here. Call it like it is. Need to bring Felicia in. 110%. This is easy for John Wildhack. Now, Buffalo's having a very good year, and they've got to finish their season, so you want to be respectful to that, but that's the answer, right? There had been some resistance to Felicia for some reason from the Board of Trustees and some people at Syracuse that are, essentially above or equal to Wildhack. Knock that nonsense off, guys. She's the answer. She wants the job. She's a great coach, and she can move you past the Coach Q era. She can move you past this dark period that Syracuse women's basketball is in with everything we found out that was going on with Coach Q. It's a no-brainer. go out there and do it. Sometimes no-brainers, though, fall on deaf ears up there. So we'll see what happens. We'll end on that note, friends. Always appreciate you watching Orange Weekly, presented by Crouse Health. Don't forget Saturday, our next broadcast, our next stream will be after Syracuse basketball plays Miami. That's a 1 o'clock tip at the Dome on Senior Day. So we'll be with you Saturday afternoon for coverage of that. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your week, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon. This has been Orange Weekly, presented by Crouse Health.